what's the difference between express and implied powers? You remember? Go ahead, Brandon.
It's in the Constitution, whether it's stated or expressed.
Okay.
In the Constitution or implied by whether you read between the lines.
Okay, an express power is specifically stated. You remember the example I've given you of an express power from Article 1, Section 8? Anybody? Congress has the power to tax. And then an implied power is basically one that is implied from the express powers. And the example I've given you was the National Bank. And I had mentioned to you that when you think about it, if you've got the power to tax, power to coin money, the power to spend, sooner or later you need someplace to put it. Does the Constitution say you can create a national bank? No, but it's implied that a bank would help you tax, spend, and coin, so they were allowed to do it.
Wasn't the case Ogden? There was a case where like the state was trying to build a bank.
Yeah, actually, Gibbons versus Ogden Gibbons versus Ogden was the case in the outline, and I don't have it listed up here, but that was the case where they defined the commerce power. And do you remember what the one word was that they defined commerce as?
Trade.
Exchange of goods.
Okay, we changed it basically to the exchange of goods and service, but they used one word. It's kind of sexual. Thank you. I knew somebody, I knew there'd be a freak up here. Okay, yeah, intercourse. They defined it as intercourse, and intercourse basically means the exchange of goods and services. So whether you're buying soap to wash the prostitute that you're soliciting, the good would be the soap, the service would be soliciting the prostitute. Either way, the exchange of goods and services. What are the two things that you need for the federal commerce power to be able to regulate? You need the exchange of goods and services, and you need it to cross state lines. And as soon as you do this, at that point, the federal commerce power kicks in. Federal government can regulate these situations. What were some of the examples that I gave you?
The
Go ahead.
Cracker Barrel.
Okay, what about the Cracker Barrel?
Where do they get their potatoes from in that type of store?
Okay, and
And
so...
the main thoroughfare, 270 or whatever it was on the main thoroughfare.
Okay, so if the Cracker Barrel was located, say, on I-95, and it was a segregated restaurant, right? How could the federal government, bless you, use the commerce power to desegregate that restaurant? You kind of hit both of them, but spell it out for me. What were the two ways that they could use it?
The one way they could say because it's so busy, you're limiting the amount of income that you're generating because of that.
Okay.
I know the other one. I don't know about the highway one.
Okay, give me the other one. About
The other one
potatoes.
was about the goods that you're getting are coming from across state.
Okay, anytime your business is involved in interstate commerce, so example would be if you got potatoes from Idaho, but your restaurant was in South Carolina, it's cross state lines. If you got Coke from Georgia and your restaurant is in South Carolina, it crossed state lines. If you got beef from Texas, or if you got ham from North Carolina, whatever the case would be, if you got straws or napkins, if your business uses anything, good or service, good, for example, that would be food or napkins or cleaning supplies, whatever, across the state lines, you are now regulatable under the Interstate Commerce Clause. What was the other one, though, dealing with the highways? Because that example I had given you was, let's say that you were in an armpit in South Carolina that wasn't by a road, an interstate highway, or wasn't by a border, so, this would be the goods coming in. But what would be like, let's say that Claudia goes to Charleston.
Was it like taking somebody else like to the beach, or was it the beaches?
We haven't gotten quite to that one yet, but yeah, that one's coming. Let's say that Claudia goes to Charleston. Charleston, is this a big tourist attraction? What would involve places in Charleston in interstate commerce before you even talk about goods?
Tourist.
What would Claudia be going down to Charleston over spring break?
A tourist.
A tourist. And as a tourist, as soon as she involves, so for example, her from Maryland going down to South Carolina on that interstate highway, she is the person that's involved in interstate commerce. So it's not just what you serve, but it's who you serve too. Okay? Now you started to mention the beach thing. What about the beach? Speaking of Claudia.
Like if you take somebody else like to the beach with you.
So if Claudia takes whom?
Another guy.
So if Claudia takes a man to the beach, and what would you describe Claudia and this man's relationship? Are they married?
No.
Okay, no, they're not married. And they go down to the beach for, say, 5 days over spring break.
Yeah.
What's the problem? What's the name of the law?
The
The Mann Act. What was the Mann Act? What was it designed to do?
Protect women from
To protect women from what?
Taking over state lines for immoral.
The Mann Act was designed to protect women, and this was passed about 100 years ago. Women were being kidnapped, taken across state lines, and then basically being prostituted against their will. 100 years ago, if you remember, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there were no pay phones, there was no nothing. So if you got captured and taken like this, odds are you weren't going to make it back home. The Mann Act said that if you forcibly transported a woman against, well actually, I didn't even say forcibly, it said if you transported a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, then you would be subject to criminal penalties. Now thinking about this, Claudia goes across state lines with her man. How are they involved in interstate commerce by crossing those state lines? Anybody? Okay, they're going to have to buy gas. They're going to have to buy, they're probably going to do what?
They have to like rest, like if they're like traveling.
So she's getting a hotel room.
I mean, I don't know.
Okay, so Claudia's getting a hotel room, she's buying gas, she's buying food, these kinds of things, and then you're saying, Nilo, that she's going to hook up as well. That's the implication. If she hooks up and they're not married, they're not, this is crossing state lines for immoral purposes. No offense, you know. I mean, but bottom line is, if you cross for immoral purposes, this actually would fall under this. And do you remember the political figure that I'd given you an example of that could have been convicted under the Mann Act? Governor Spitzer, former governor of New York, because he had solicited that prostitute from New York, basically he'd come down from New York down into this area and solicited that prostitute. So would it necessarily mean that Claudia's doing something more? No, it really doesn't. But if you get the wrong judge, and Benny, I think I had used you as the example in the 11 o'clock class. You were like, yeah, I'm going to be doing immoral stuff. Bottom line is, when you think about it, you could be brought up on interstate commerce violations. That's how deep this goes. Do you remember the one limitation?
The what?
The one limitation on the federal commerce power that we talked about? Oh, shame on you. What was the one thing that the federal government tried to regulate using the commerce power that the court said no?
Guns
in schools. It struck down the Gun-Free School Act. Why? What was the logic that they tried to say guns in schools affected commerce? I started to walk when I did this sideways. Remember?
Because the guns are usually purchased from but they were stretching.
That actually makes sense if the guns were purchased in another state, but that's not what they said. Go ahead, Hisham.
They said that if you're scared in a classroom, then you won't be able to learn, and then you won't be able to get a good education, and then you won't get a job, so you won't be involved in the economy.
You won't be able to earn as much if you don't get as good a job, and that's going to affect interstate commerce. So yeah, we took like 5 or 6 steps to get here, and the court said, you know what, we don't support guns in schools, but you know what, the states have already got these laws, and this is not the commerce power, this is stretching that power too finely. So there weren't very many examples of this, but that was the one, because the commerce power is the biggest power federal government has. On this, privileges and immunities, tax and spend, because we're just about out of time. Privileges and immunities, tax and spend, the commerce power, make sure that you've got examples. And we talked about these just maybe earlier this week or at the end of last week. Tax and spend, if you remember, we were talking about the drinking age. Be able to explain that one pretty good. Privileges and immunities, we were talking about the welfare and South Carolina versus Connecticut, and then Pennsylvania versus North Carolina. Some of you said I broke the law. This would be good examples of these. Breon, you had mentioned a few minutes ago in the beginning. Where was the power in the beginning of the Constitution? Who had the power? Go ahead.
The states?
The states did. If you go back, the states had the power. It was the Supreme Court that began to referee federal versus state decisions, and they were talking about that Article 6 Supremacy Clause. And if you remember in the outline, it started with the states had the bulk of the power probably up until about the end of the Civil War. And then from the end of the Civil War up until about the time of the Great Depression, basically the federal government began to catch up so that they were roughly eye to eye. And then from 1932, which is when the New Deal started, up until 1980, you basically had the federal government leap ahead of the states by leaps and bounds. Today, the federal government is still ahead. They're trying to give it back, and that was the devolution revolution, but they have not necessarily been that successful with that. So that's those. Articles, we have the weed article talking about medicinal marijuana, and the other article that we have